Please welcome the president of the Bipartisan Policy Center, Jason Grommet.
You really should sit down. This is going to be a long, long speech. Well, I want to thank you all very much for joining us this evening, and really deep thanks and gratitude to Nancy Lindborg and all of the staff here at USIP for their partnership and their collaboration in this evening. I think we all begin tonight thinking about the families of the 9/11 victims, some of whom are in this room today. It was their determination to uncover the truth that created the 9/11 Commission, and their tenacious advocacy for recommendations that have ultimately resulted in so much achievement and protection for the rest of us, and so we honor and thank them. As people have said in different ways, the heartbreak of that day also has inspired incredible resolve, vigilance, and appreciation for the shared identity that we all have as Americans. And these admirable traits have clearly anchored the careers of Tom Kean and Lee Hamilton, and they've also inspired one of the great partnerships in the modern political era. Like Lennon and McCarthy, Watson and Crick, Ben and Jerry, Lee and Tom's collaboration is truly iconic. Their dignity, their courage, and their proud partisanship reflect the democratic ideals that animate the Bipartisan Policy Center and the award that we are presenting shortly. I think a lot of people like to observe that our country, despite all of its challenges, still comes together in crisis. But the quality and the unanimity of the 9/11 Commission's report was not something that was easy or certainly not inevitable. I think we need to remember that the Commission did its work in the run-up to the 2004 very contested election, during the strident and I think rather aggressive debate on the Iraq War and a lot of other issues. And under different leadership, the Commission could have easily devolved into the kind of partisan finger-pointing, focusing on blame instead of solutions. But from the very start of that exercise, Tom and Lee understood the importance of consensus, as well as the courage required to actually achieve it. They also understood that leaders set the tone, and they have never wavered from their commitment to civility or to one another. We have been talking a lot about political courage tonight, and I can't help but think about Senator McCain. Senator McCain came to the BPC about a year ago and commented that he liked the Bipartisan Policy Center because we brought together some of his really best friends, like Leon Panetta, and some of his really worst enemies, like Leon Panetta. And really it was through Senator McCain's humor and despite his pain that he understood, and I think a number of people have commented on this, that America's greatness is not just a source of our power, but it's also about American purpose. And that idea flows very much through the USIP and our work. While Tom and Lee are both very modest in presentation, anyone who knows them knows that they are absolutely tenacious in the defense of principle and the pursuit of good policy. The Bipartisan Policy Center has benefited from this fortitude during their decade-long leadership of our national security project. At BPC, Tom and Lee have led a variety of different task forces and commissions that enable them to continue their collaboration, building on the insights and the unfinished business of the Commission. So at this time of acute national division, I'm really proud to honor their grace, their diligence, their optimism, and their patriotism. I have to share, and I think many of you know this, that Congressman Hamilton late yesterday determined that he could not join us. But thanks to the good people at C-SPAN, I am told he is watching from his living room, so hi Lee. He will also share a few recorded words with us later tonight. And it is really now my great privilege to introduce Nancy Lindborg, who is going to offer some remarks.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Jason. And it's really wonderful to be able to co-host this evening in partnership with the Bipartisan Policy Center. And I'm delighted to welcome so many distinguished guests, many partners and special friends for our program this evening, with a special welcome to our keynote speaker, the Director of National Intelligence, Daniel Coats. As Jason has outlined, we're gathering for the anniversary of the worst terrorist attack in our nation's history, and we're reminded once again of the urgency of our mission to build peace and to resolve conflict around the world. USIP was, in fact, founded by Congress in 1984 by war veterans who were weary of their war experiences in World War II and the Korean War, and established USIP with the mission of working to resolve international conflicts around the world. And we are dedicated to the idea that peace is very possible. It's also quite practical, and it is absolutely essential for our national security. And so we work with partners around the world in the pursuit of peace in very practical ways to resolve conflict. We're delighted to be able to use our global headquarters for these kinds of gatherings, bringing people together from across disciplines, different experiences, different political persuasions. And that's why it's a particular pleasure to partner with BPC to honor two exceptional Americans. And tonight, as we honor Congressman Hamilton and Governor Kaine, we are able to reflect on their long career as public servants, for their immeasurable contributions to American security. And just to underscore one of Jason's points, more importantly than ever, for the example they provide of how great leaders put political differences aside for greater national good. And at a time when it greatly mattered, Tom and Lee stepped up to serve as chairs of the 9/11 Commission, which produced a landmark document that led to the overhauling of our national security infrastructure and protected our homeland from future attacks. And so in the years since that report was released, we've seen the adoption of many of their recommendations on a bipartisan basis that enabled us to successfully weaken terrorist organizations abroad, and most importantly, to protect the homeland from another mass casualty attack. But one crucial recommendation from the 9/11 report remains unfilled. And even 14 years ago, Tom and Lee foresaw the need and included in the report the recommendation to develop a comprehensive strategy that goes beyond responding to violent extremism and focused on preventing its rise in the first place. And in the words of their report, a preventive strategy that is as much or more political as it is military. We've seen that without this successful prevention strategy in place, that terrorism, in fact, has continued to spread. And the number of terrorist attacks worldwide have gone from fewer than 2,000 in 2001 to more than 10,000 in 2017. And we're seeing that extremists have in particular gained a foothold in the fragile states where the social contract between government and their people is fundamentally broken, and where they find fertile ground for recruiting aggrieved, disenfranchised societies, and in particular youth. And they win public sympathy by providing the services that their governments in those countries do not. So last year, USIP, as it often is, was directed by Congress to convene a task force. And this task force is to tackle the issues that lead to the spread of terrorism in fragile states. And we were asked to develop a comprehensive strategy for tackling extremism with a focus on the Sahel, the Near East, and the Horn of Africa. And we are enormously grateful that Governor Kaine and Congressman Hamilton once again answered the call for public service and really saw this as the completion of an arc from their very important work on the 9/11 Commission. And they are joined in this effort by a very thoughtful bipartisan task force, a number of whom are here with us today. Could I ask you to stand? Our commission members, our task force members, Senator Ayotte, Ambassador Eikenberry, Ambassador Dobryansky, our board chair Steve Hadley, Farouk Kathwari, and thank you each of you for the, Ambassador Johnny Carson. The task force is further supported by a group of senior advisors, many of whom are also here with us today, and we thank all of you for the ideas, the commitment, and the energy that you're putting into the task force. So our program tonight gives us an opportunity not only to reflect on and honor the legacy of Tom and Lee, but also to look forward to the culmination of their efforts through their work with the task force today. Under their leadership, the task force has produced an interim report. You'll find it at your seats. And this report serves to underscore the interlocking nature of the challenges posed by fragility and extremism. Over the next few months, these interim findings will inform a final report, which will include very specific concrete proposals for how do we turn a decade of learning and scholarship into action that matters. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. We welcome everybody's good thoughts and ideas. And most of all, we extend our gratitude to Congressman Hamilton and Governor Kane for picking up this challenge once again. So with that, thank you once again for joining us. We're delighted to have this evening together, and enjoy your dinners.
Please welcome the Director of National Intelligence, the Honorable Daniel Coats.
Well, Jason and Nancy, thank you. Institute for Peace, thank you for the honor to speak to you this evening. I'm still doing a little bit of, that one came real quick. It's always a danger to be speaking before dinner is served. You do have salads on your table. My only thought here is, as my mother continually told me as a child, please keep your mouth closed when you chew, but I urge you to chew. The other thing that came to my mind was the story about the pastor delivering a wonderful sermon and greeting those parishioners on the way out, beaming because he thought he really delivered a good sermon. And got all the accolades, and Maud came up to him, regular attender forever, said, "Pastor, yes, that was." He said, "What did you think of my sermon?" She said, "I thought it was very good, but I believe you missed a critical opportunity." He said, "Opportunity for what?" She said, "To quit." I make it to the point this evening where if you look hungry enough, I might have to quit in the middle. But I want to thank you for the honor of being here and talking to you. I've enjoyed a long partnership with the Bipartisan Policy Center. Following my return from Germany, I served as co-chair along with former Senator and my former Senate colleague, Chuck Robb. Little did I know, it was on the Iran task force. Little did I know then that I would be standing here today as Director of National Intelligence, and virtually every morning reading or looking or asking what happened in Iran last night. So it's a pleasure to know that BPC, in combination with the Institute for Peace, is still putting out great programs, great information that is of value to those policymakers that will be taking a look at this. It'll be of value to this country for what you're doing, and you have some terrific people here to do that. I want to acknowledge my former colleague, Kelly Ayotte, who I had the distinct privilege of serving with. Kelly, I miss you. The Senate misses you. The country misses you. And we hope that you will continue to see and seize opportunities to serve your country, because I know how much you love your country. And I'm glad that you're here doing what you're doing, and others. Governor Keating just told me he's moving back home. I moved back home, and now I'm back here. So be careful. Be really careful. Chuck Robb and I had a terrific time working together. And another good friend is in the audience, Jim Slattery. I'm a Republican, he's a Democrat. We actually like each other. So Jim, I know you're part of this commission also. My respect for the BPC approach to the way they do things, just the facts, analysis, and actionable solutions to our nation's key challenges is what we're looking for in the intelligence agency. And we do get just the facts from that on a bipartisan basis, along with solutions, and we very much appreciate that. But tonight I'm really here to honor and pay tribute to two great American patriots, Congressman Lee Hamilton and Governor Tom Kean, and reflect on their legacy and contributions to our nation's counterterrorism efforts. As a fellow Hoosier and cherished colleague in the Congress, and Lee, sorry that you can't be here, fully understand, but you're here in spirit, I know. Lee is a longtime friend and former colleague. Lee has earned great respect from members of both sides of the aisle for his exceptional leadership on matters of foreign policy and national security. He served as an example with his formative intellect, his tireless work ethic, and nonpartisanship. I'm not surprised that Lee signed up, Tom, along with you, for this next step. And you know what a privilege it is to work with Lee. And while our political careers have some parallels, Lee achieved many milestones, including one that I will always envy and never achieve. He was inducted into the Indiana Basketball Hall of Fame. Trust me, as far as Hoosiers are concerned, nothing else you can do in life comes close to that achievement. And Tom Kean's lifetime of service to this nation and higher education is truly remarkable. From governor of New Jersey to co-chair of the 9/11 Commission to president of Drew University, Tom is widely respected for his approach to leadership and his willingness and ability to work with others to achieve a common goal. So we gather to honor these two men on the somber anniversary of September 11. I stood this morning at the Pentagon during the ceremony, on the side of the Pentagon where our son-in-law, as a young Army captain, was serving. Marcia and I had been in Germany just the weekend before, starting our ambassadorship. September 11 was the second day on my job. When I noticed that the plane flew into that portion of the Pentagon, I knew that's exactly where our son-in-law was. His commanding officer was killed, as was one of his aides. He miraculously survived all that, so that moment came back to me in a very personal way. And we are grateful that he survived, and we regret that so many lives were lost. As I said, we had arrived in Germany just the weekend before, and literally my very first activity after saying hello to all the staff the very next day, I had asked the staff to find someone who could best provide the experience of the relationship between the United States and Germany post-war. And so at our residence up the driveway came a German citizen, 88 years old, of Jewish descent named Dr. Ernst Kramer. His life story was remarkable and inspiring, and it speaks to the importance of service to a cause greater than oneself. As a young teenage man, he and his entire extended family were sent to Buchenwald. After their arrival, the family cobbled together whatever valuables they had and managed to smuggle him out of the camp and into the hands of people who could send him to the United States. Shortly thereafter, then 17-year-old Ernst wound up living on a farm in Mississippi where he attended his senior year of high school. That year was 1941. The very morning after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Ernst said, "I'm not going to the high school today. I'm going to the Army Recruiting Center. I want to go back. I want to join the military and go back and free my people in Germany." He landed early on the beaches of Normandy and ultimately was part of the team that liberated Buchenwald, only to learn that his entire family had been murdered in the Holocaust. He vowed never to let it happen again and became a stalwart for U.S.-German relations for the rest of his life. Still going at 88, he had been editor of the largest circulated newspaper in Germany and wrote regular columns about our relationship. As we finished lunch, our focus turned to the issue of future threats to our respective nations. Dr. Kramer shared with me that his growing concern about terrorism and radical ideology, believing that this would be the biggest challenge to the free world in years ahead. Unknown to us, as we were concluding our discussion, the first plane hit the World Trade Center's North Tower. As I walked him to the door and said goodbye, my staff rushed in and said, "Turn on CNN." Marcia and I watched with horror as a second plane crashed into the second tower, and then news reports came in about another missing plane and an explosion at the Pentagon. To use the words of the 9/11 Commission's report, on that day, at that time, the United States became a nation transformed. And that day, and our nation's response to the attacks, would define my tour in Germany. And back home, it forced our nation to rethink our approach to national security. Lee and Tom were once again asked to serve their nation. They were charged with leading the 9/11 Commission to evaluate what had happened and how we could prevent it from happening again. And under their leadership, the Commission delivered an unflinching and bipartisan analysis of what went wrong. In many ways, the Commission's final report contains valuable lessons and important historical information related to terrorist activities in the decade prior to the attacks that remain relevant today to today's threat environment. And they offered recommendations that provided the basis for reforms of our intelligence and national security architecture in 2005. This included the creation of the National Counterterrorism Center and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Little did I know at the time that I would one day serve in this position. The intelligence community that I have the privilege to lead today is the result of Lee and the result of Tom and that commission. And that decision, now 12 years later, has left us with a more integrated, more capable, and more technologically advanced than it has ever been. To demonstrate how far we've come, let me paint a picture for you of what our National Counterterrorism Center looks like today. NCTC is the counterterrorism hub for the entire intelligence community. Around-the-clock operation, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, 24 hours on 3 shifts. Step inside and poke your head in NCTC's Operations Center, and you'll notice a buzz of activity as officers monitor the latest reports from around the globe. including as many as 1,000 or more cables and reports every single day. Open a conference room and you'll see NCTC officers leading one of several interagencies VTCs convened every day to maintain situational awareness across the U.S. government on the latest CT threats. And as you stroll through the hallways, you might bump into a CIA officer, an FBI agent, or a local first responder, or a military representative, or an operations officer, all here on rotation at NCTC to contribute to a common mission and serve as ambassadors from their home organizations. For anyone who has been involved in the standing up of a new government organization or assembling an interagency team, you know that it was no small feat to realize Lee and Tom's vision. Before 9/11, no organization in the U.S. government had access to all CT information. Now, NCTC analysts have direct access to foreign and domestic threat information from networks all across the government: CIA, NSA, FBI, DOD, DHS, to name a few. Before 9/11, there was no single electronic library of terrorism-related information. Now, NCTC maintains a central repository that officials from all around the government can access with a click of a key. Before 9/11, there were 4 databases of known and suspected terrorists and 13 watch lists. Now we have a single database of terrorists and a single watch list, which with instant access by all our agencies. And before 9/11, there was no concerted effort to integrate CT operations. And now NCTC leads efforts to bring all elements of state power to bear against CT threats. This integrated approach to CT is a model for the rest of the intelligence community. And we're applying some of the lessons learned from our counterterrorism efforts to other transnational problem sets: counterintelligence, cyber, transnational organized crime, and counterproliferation. As Director of National Intelligence, I'm focusing on these same principles: info sharing, intel integration, and incorporating disparate viewpoints to ensure that the intelligence community, all 17 agencies, delivers the best possible intelligence to our policymakers. The United States and allied efforts over the past 17 years have thwarted dozens of plots and thoroughly disrupted terrorist capabilities. We have particularly degraded their capacity to conduct large-scale 9/11-style external operations. But as far as we've come, and as good as we are today, we know that we cannot rest, because the threat landscape has changed dramatically and demands our constant attention. In addition to a complex terrorism landscape that is global, we now face a great power competition, delicate negotiations with North Korea, a pervasive cyber threat, and the troubling use of chemical weapons against civilians in the war-torn rubble of Syria and the peaceful paved streets of Salisbury, England. The complexity of the terrorist threat today is most evident when you compare it to the centralized, large-scale plotting we saw from Al-Qaeda in 2001. Today, the threat is global, it's less centralized, and in many cases, harder to detect. And if history has taught us anything, it is that this fight will not end, unfortunately, anytime soon. We have simply entered a new phase in the post-9/11 counterterrorism fight. Despite significant setbacks in Syria and Iraq, ISIS' ability to launch an insurgency and carry out terrorist attacks abroad has not yet been sufficiently diminished. We continue to see members of this group pursue and develop creative and alarming methods of attack, dispersing throughout the globe, yes, in many ungoverned places. Meanwhile, Al-Qaeda has evolved as it dealt with the loss of many leaders. Today, the group's leadership is concentrated in the Middle East, where they have a greater ability to operate and remain an enduring threat to the United States. And both ISIS and Al-Qaeda continue to inspire attacks by radicalized, homegrown, violent extremists. We also face a growing terrorist threat from Iran and its terrorist allies. Tehran remains the most prominent state sponsor of terrorism in the world. So, as we look to the future, we must continue to identify and counter enduring drivers that are sustaining terrorist resilience and regeneration. And one of those key drivers is what Lee and Tom have focused on with the Task Force on Extremism in Fragile States. The weak or non-existent government and governance in fragile and failing states and its socioeconomic consequences. All of the terrorist groups I have referenced are working to expand their influence in unstable regions. They're exploiting degraded local security conditions in pursuit of safe haven, in pursuit of resources or recruits. These activities remind us of the importance of using non-military levers, including economic assistance and humanitarian aid, to counter terrorist influence and undermine their presence. And thus, the Bipartisan Policy Center's work and the Institute of Peace work to study these dynamics and identify elements of a preventive strategy is instructive to our long-term counterterrorism efforts. While we must maintain our CT pressure, it will be our efforts to address the underlying drivers of terrorism that will ultimately yield success in this generational struggle. I would like to close here by offering once again my congratulations to you, Tom. Lee, my congratulations to you, my friend, for your extraordinary service to our nation. On this day, when we remember and reflect on the tragedy of 9/11, it is fitting that we honor these two leaders who have set aside partisan differences to find solutions that makes our country stronger and who have helped guide our nation's efforts to counter the scourge of terrorism. To borrow a slightly modified phrase from the Bible, to acknowledge the work of Lee and Tom, well done, good and faithful public servants. Thank you.
Please welcome former Governor of Oklahoma, Frank Keating.
I know we're all waiting to eat, so what was anticipated to be a Fidel Castro 2 hours and 27-minute address by me will be 47 seconds. The chaplain's comments earlier about the experience of those who served and sacrificed on 9/11 brings to mind a story in my own tragic experience as the governor of Oklahoma during the Oklahoma City bombing. We had urban search and rescue teams from all over the United States, including several from the Washington metro area. And from New York came Ray Downey, who was the deputy chief of the New York Fire Department, who brought the New Yorkers to assist us in our time of need. A group of nuns from Bavaria sent me several rosaries. And I went out to the site of the tragedy, and seeing Downey out there, I said, "Hey, Ray, are you a Catholic?" And in his own inimitable New York way, he said, "Is the Pope a Catholic?" So I gave him this rosary. I kept one for myself, and he put it over his neck. For those of us who are Catholics, that's not terribly common, but he did. Later, Henry Kravis, another former Oklahoman in New York, had an event at his apartment to raise money for the victims. And there across the room was Ray Downey, all gussied up. And I walked over to him and I said, "Ray, sir, it is wonderful to see you again. It's been obviously several months since our horrible experience." And he said, "Well, put your hand right here." Well, I put my hand on his chest, and he had that rosary still around his neck. Well, 9/11 was a tragic day in the Downey family, and for all those firefighters and rescue workers who came to help us in Oklahoma City, many of them were killed, including Ray Downey. They never found his body. Downey was a wonderful human being, religious, funny, a vital person, so representative of our fellow citizens who were murdered on that day. I went up there to thank his wife and thank, obviously, his colleagues. And the remainder of his team gave me a fabricated cross from Tower 1 that was still hot. I have it on my desk at the office in Oklahoma City, and it'll always be there because those were memories of wonderful men and women of courage and faith and perseverance who did so much for us in a horrible time in the history of our state. But tonight, as we know, we are celebrating the lives of two extraordinary people who are patriots. They are bipartisan. My grandfather from Illinois served in the Congress one term and didn't run again. He was a Democrat. When I was a member of the State House and State Senate in my state, there weren't any Republicans. We were treated like children, seen and not heard. So my whole life in public life and politics surrounded the concept that I may not like your bad ideas, but I like you. And the conversations necessary at every level of government, at the state level, federal level, obviously the local level, to listen and learn and converse is essential in a free society, because we simply cannot, as a society, erect barriers between us. The debate should be robust and full and factual, and then let the voters vote. We have two honorees this evening for this Patriot Award. I can't think of any two better people. As a product of Culver Military Academy, there's a little bit of Indiana in me. But, in Lee's case and Tom's case, and Lee obviously with the Indiana connection, men of one party and another who saw that what was important was to solve problems. And you look at the 9/11 Commission report, and it is exactly that. The only people that these two men are married to are their wives. Nobody else, not their party. Their love of country is unassailable. We have listened to the biographies of these individuals, and we have listened and we have read the biographies. But when Coretta Scott King complimented Tom in just a wonderfully glorious way, my old classmate Bill Clinton, the comments he's made about Lee Hamilton, all of you know of these friendships, these support bases, these mutual respects. Is there any wonder that we could not find a better duo than these individuals? Now, as Jason said, we're going to see a video here shortly, and I can say this is my last official function as chairman of the board of the Bipartisan Policy Center. I've returned to the ranch. But that said, we're going to hear from Lee. But at this time, it is my thrill, joy, and honor on all of our behalves to give the Patriot Award for this year to this individual that we know so much about and have learned so much about as a gloriously successful governor of New Jersey, back when they had Republicans in New Jersey. I can say that as a Republican. A gloriously successful governor of New Jersey, and a man of every milestone, a man of every universe, a man with his wonderful wife who've done so much for their state and for their country. But Tom, if you would step forward, I have a special presentation to make on behalf of the Bipartisan Policy Center to you. And they want us to stand right here so we can smile. There you go.
A lot about Tom, and we thought it would actually be kind of polite if we let Tom say a couple of things. And let me just start out, Tom, by noting that I remember you telling me once that you and Lee agreed that you would never appear with microphones without one another. And so I do appreciate the indulgence tonight, but Lee is watching, so I think we're going to have to behave ourselves. So I have a couple of questions. And one is to really think about your and Lee's partnership, which is pretty remarkable. It's quite powerful. You seem to have drawn strength from each other, certainly in my interactions. But my understanding is you didn't really know one another when the 9/11 Commission began. And so I guess my first question was, was it mutual admiration at first sight? What was it like when you and Lee were brought together into this incredible moment?
I can't imagine the first sight of me was admiration, but I had known Lee by reputation. We had met, maybe shaken hands, but that's about all. And we met for the first time. We were both second choices. The first choices were Henry Kissinger for the job, and the second, and Senator Mitchell was going to be Lee. And we both agreed that neither of us had gotten along with the other one if we had been with Mitchell or with Kissinger. But first time we got together, I've got a funny background. I was Speaker of the New Jersey Assembly when there was no majority. Each party had the same number of votes, and they settled on me, and I had to work for 2 years with a legislature where you couldn't get votes, anything passed, unless you got people from both parties. And when I was governor, I never had a Republican state senate my whole 8 years. So if we hadn't worked together, we would have gotten nothing done. So I was accustomed to working for policy across party lines. And so the first thing I said to Lee, and I'm repeating now something that I think Lee would tell you if he were here, because I didn't know about this. I said to Lee, look, we've been both appointed here. He was vice chairman, I was chairman, but I said, we're going to be equal. We're going to work together, and I'm not going to do anything that you don't think is right. And, we'll make all the decisions jointly on staff and policy and everything else. And I thought that was the normal thing to do. Lee told me afterwards, he said, I was so surprised. He said, in Congress, the chairman is everything, and the vice chairman is nothing. And so when you said that, I was both happy and shocked. But anyway, we worked that way all the way through. Lee and I agreed on everything all the way through, and we didn't do anything if we didn't agree, although we did agree. We agreed without asking each other on most things.
So I mentioned earlier that I think people have kind of come to take for granted the 9/11 Commission's success. And, when I look at the list, where's Ben Veniste? There were some pretty partisan people on that commission. And I remember, right up front, of course, I remember you saying at one point that the commission was designed to fail. Reflect on that a little bit and talk a little more about what you and Lee did to try to make sure that didn't happen.
Since you mentioned him, Lee and I, when you're chairman, vice chairman, whatever, you get a lot of the credit. But the commissioners were terrific, each and every one of them. And Richard Ben Veniste was one of the best, and he's here. So, Richard, thank you. Thank you so much. And the second thing is, what I call the wind in our sails were the families of 9/11. They were there all the way. They supported us when we testified. They lobbied for our report. They got us more time and more money when we needed it. They were an incredible group of people who suffered the worst loss a human being could possibly suffer in many cases, and came back to work in general for the public good in the memory of their family member they lost. And I haven't seen her, but I think Mary Fetchett's here, who's chairman of the Voices of 9/11. Thank you. I see you. I see them both now. Those two were housewives who sat down in congressional offices, picketed the White House when necessary, and did whatever they could to get that report written and through. So thank you again. And look, the question, now what was your question again?
was asking you to comment a little bit on the idea that this was not a bunch of centrists. These were people with pretty intense views. And one of the things that is important to us at the Bipartisan Policy Center is not to be the centrist policy center or the nonpartisan policy center, but to demonstrate that people with strong, principled, aggressive views can still actually respect one another and find common cause. And I wanted you to reflect on that a bit.
We agreed to do certain things as commissioners. For instance, because I was chairman, I got all the invitations to meet the press and all the other shows. I remember telling Russett that I would not go on the show without Lee Hamilton. And Tim Russett said over the phone to me, he said, you know, you don't know Washington very well, but we don't allow guests to invite guests. And I said, well, get somebody else then. And about half an hour later, he called back and said, if you'll come on, you and Lee are very welcome. So Lee and I went on together on every show together. And after that, the commissioners did the same thing. Like Noah's Ark, they paired up 2 by 2. So if any Republican was asked, they brought a Democrat. If a Democrat was asked, they brought a Republican. We made sure at meetings never to sit next to each other in the same party. We divided as we sat in hearings and everything else. And we became very close friends in the process. And people who lost their partisanship, not right away, but over time, to the extent that we just wanted to do a job and we respected the person sitting next to us as somebody who was equally dedicated to do that job. So I think bipartisanship is not always easy. You got to work at it. But if you work at it, you can get more done than you ever might imagine.
Now, Tom, I think you understood this to be a very public moment, and good politicians are often great storytellers. My favorite reflection on the commission report was from John Updike, who wrote in the New Yorker, "The King James Bible, our language's lone masterpiece produced by committee, at least until this year's 9/11 Commission report." You understood early on that this was going to be an intensely public affair. How did you prepare the group and yourselves for that kind of scrutiny?
Well, we had to do it not in the normal manner of producing a government report. First of all, when we hired the staff, we hired 3 historians, starting with the director of the staff, because we thought we were writing a report about history and for history. So we had those people working on it. We didn't think it was going to be issued simply by the government printing office. Because I called them and said, how do you do these things normally? He said, no, it's available to people, and if they call in, they can get it for $40 or something. I said, that's not what we want. So we called some academic printers that I knew from being in academia and said, you know, if you can give us the fastest time of production and you can give us the lowest price to the public, we will let you have what we will label the official copy. Well, the government printing office got wind of it and called up and said, that's illegal, you can't do that. And I said, you print as many copies as you want. But this is the official copy because Lee and I are going to sign it as such. And so we got it very cheaply in the bookstores within a matter of days after we finished it, available to every single person in the country at a very low price. And so that's sort of where we proceeded, to make sure that everything we'd done was available to everybody.
So I have a final question before we hear from Lee for a few moments and then have a discussion about the task force you're now leading. And that is that you've been described by everybody as an optimist. And it's tough sledding out there. And so I wanted to ask you, what is it that makes you optimistic about the future?
Oh, I think living for 80 years in this country, I think as an American, I've always been enormously optimistic about this country. I've never known any place that's any better. The people are the best in the world, I've always thought. And I've always thought no matter what, it's easy to look out and see problems. And we've got more of them than I ever remember, a lot of them. But we're also a people that finds solutions. And I believe that about the American people. And I believe whatever the problem is, sooner or later, good people are going to get together and they're going to find solutions. That's the way it's always been in this country, and that's the way I think it'll always be in this country.
Well, Tom, it has been We'll just close by saying that working with you and Lee has really been one of the great honors of my career, and it is really terrific to be able to share this moment with you, so thank you. You stay. So,
Let me say, Jason's going to introduce him, but one of the great privileges and pleasures of my life is working with Lee Hamilton. Lee Hamilton is one of nature's gentlemen, and we became friends. Not a month goes by we haven't talked to each other, I don't think, since the commission, and he is one of the most first-class people I've ever met in my life, so you go ahead and introduce him.
well, so after that, Lee was really disappointed that he couldn't come, and somehow he, with great generosity, got to Indiana University earlier today to make a video, and he made like a 27-minute video. And so with the greatest of affection, the staff at PPC and USIP have done a very awkward job of editing this to something that felt more appropriate for the moment. And so we are going to share some comments from Lee now, and then Tom's going to be joined on stage by Nancy and Steve Hadley to talk a little bit about the task force that he is currently leading.
Good evening, and thank you all for being here tonight. I'm honored to be among you. I'm sorry I can't be with you personally, but that's unavoidable. So I'll do the next best thing and talk to you electronically. I am honored, very honored, to receive this Patriot Award from the Bipartisan Policy Center. And it's especially pleasing to me to receive it alongside Tom Kean. There may be a greater American than Tom Kean, I just haven't run into him myself. He's a marvelous person to work with, and I deeply cherish his friendship, and I consider it a high privilege to have worked with him and to receive this honor from the Bipartisan Policy Center with Tom. After the terrible tragedy of 9/11, the American people wanted facts and they wanted solutions. The commission took, the 9/11 Commission took as its mandate, first of all, to find out the facts, and secondly, to try to suggest some conclusions and solutions. What happened on that terrible day, 17 years ago today, and we hope, of course, it will never be repeated. I want to thank several people. First, I want to thank my fellow commissioners. What a marvelous group to work with. Tom Kean, of course, Richard Benvenisti, Bob Carey, Fred Fielding, John Lehman, Jamie Gorelick, Tim Romer, Slade Gordon, Jim Thompson. They were just superb to work with, each one of them contributing significantly to the work and the success of the commission. Now, the members of the commission join me in recognizing, of course, the families of 9/11. They turned their grief into constructive and positive action. They used it to push us for answers. They were supportive, they were critical at times, but always valuable associates as we pursued our mandate of finding the facts and suggesting solutions. Tonight, we remember their loss, heartbreaking as it was, and we honor their particular courage and their marvelous reaction to tragedy. They have turned it into a singular service to the United States of America and to the welfare of its citizens. In the 10 years that Tom and I have worked on projects of the Bipartisan Policy Center, we've accomplished a great deal, but he and I have come to appreciate greatly the Bipartisan Policy Center. We live at a time when people are worried about the polarized politics of the country. We see a lot of centrifugal forces operating that drive us apart, polarization. It's a very difficult environment in public policy and in the public dialogue to work within. But the Bipartisan Policy Center has shown the way for this country and for a lot of other groups with the themes of collaboration and cooperation and bipartisanship. I commend them for that leadership. It has been a powerful example for this country at a time of deep division and polarization. So I'm grateful to the Bipartisan Policy Center, its president, Jason Grumet, for giving Tom and me the chance to continue working on some of these important issues. We are very grateful to Vartan Gregorian and to the Carnegie Corporation for supporting our work, without which, of course, it could not be done. We, all of us, are very keenly aware of the fact that there's a lot more work to be done. I'm also pleased tonight to see the release of the first report of the task force on extremism in the fragile states. 17 years ago today, as we all recognize, we had the gravest attack on our country, perhaps in its history, but certainly one of the gravest attacks. We've made a lot of progress since then. We've strengthened our homeland protections. We've gone after the terrorists effectively. We've killed and eliminated a lot of bad actors. But there's a lot more to be done, as all of us recognize. We have to continue to use force to attack and eliminate terrorists. We have to continue and do even a better job of protecting our homeland, where I think the record has been very good indeed since that awful day. But new threats to our security continue to emerge, and new generations continue to feel the impact of extremism and violence. For that reason, we are, Tom and I, very pleased to have the privilege of continuing to serve by leading the task force on extremism in fragile states. Here, in conjunction with the support of the United States Institute of Peace, and in response from a mandate by the Congress. I would certainly want to thank the USIP's President, Nancy Lindbergh, the USIP Chair, Steve Hadley, and the members of the task force that are here tonight. They are a talented group of people. They are real experts in national security. They are a delight to work with in all aspects. And because of their contributions, our work will be immensely improved and helpful in the years ahead.
Please welcome the distinguished members of the Task Force on Extremism in Fragile States. The United States Institute of Peace Board Chair, Stephen Hadley, former Senator Kelly Ayotte, and the President of the United States Institute of Peace, Nancy Lindbergh.
I hope you will continue to enjoy your meal as it gets distributed over the course of the evening. We'll try and get everybody through the dessert court. We're going to spend about 15, 20 minutes talking about the report. and the reflections of these members of the task force on the report. We'll probably do about enough time for just 2 rounds of questions. And let me begin, if I can, with Governor Kaine, with you. There has not been a major terrorist attack in the U.S. since 9/11. Osama bin Laden is dead. The Islamic State's caliphate lies in rubble. So what's the problem here? Why should policymakers be talking about preventing extremism now? And why would you, with all the things you could do, why would you then pick up the co-chairmanship of this task force?
Well, when we did, our commissioners did the 9/11 report, we basically talked about 3 things that needed to be done. One was obviously they had a sanctuary in Afghanistan, reach those people who did it, and destroy them. That was number 1. Secondly, we didn't want this to ever happen again or anything like it. So the second recommendation really was to harden our defenses, to create Dan Coats and people of that stature to really coordinate our intelligence operation and make sure that we had the best defenses in the world as from a terrorist attack. And the third thing we said was when we've got to do some preventive measures to get at the ideology itself so we don't create more terrorists. Well, the first 2 we did. We've done pretty successfully. The last, not so much. So this is really, in a sense, a continuation of the 9/11 work. It's to look and see where terrorists come from, where they breed, which is in failed states or fragile states, and see if we can do something about the breeding ground. What we said in our 9/11 report, we would not have had an attack if those terrorists hadn't been allowed to organize and be left alone for 3 years in Afghanistan to plot and to plan. If they hadn't been able to do that, they couldn't have pulled it off. We said don't ever allow that kind of place to exist again. We have to disrupt it. So this is an effort and a continuation of our work. Sooner or later, these people, as they continue to spread, and there are 10 times more terrorist attacks last year than there were after 9/11. Find a way to prevent terrorism, and the way to prevent terrorism is to work in these failed states or fragile states and make sure they're strong enough to prevent terrorism in those states themselves.
Senator Ayotte, let me ask you this question. Almost every think tank session you go to these days talking about national security challenges, people say, well, what we've seen is the emergence or the reemergence of great power competition with Russia and China. Where does extremism and combating extremism rank in your view compared to the problem of dealing with Russia and China? And I think many Americans would ask, given the problems presented by Russia and China, why should we pay attention to what's happening in the Sahel and the Middle East and North Africa?
Well, first of all, I just want to say it's a huge honor to be on this task force with Governor Kaine and Congressman Hamilton, given their incredible leadership. So why is this important? I mean, first of all, we know from the National Defense Strategy that, yes, great power strategic competition is a huge threat to us from China and Russia, but also identified in that strategy, which we all know in this room, and Governor Kaine knows all too well, it describes terrorism and extremism as a persistent condition. And unfortunately, it is a persistent condition. As the Director of National Intelligence Coats said, we're seeing a new phase in terrorism, and these areas that we are focusing on this commission, the Sahel, the Near East, the Horn of Africa, unfortunately, these are very fragile areas, and there are other fragile areas around the world where we see the continual breeding of extremism and terrorism that leads to a persistent threat to not only our homeland, but to our allies, and of course, really what they tried to hit us on 9/11, which was our way of life. What we've also seen is this strategic competition we've seen countries like Russia and China in particular exploiting fragile states and exploiting this fragility actually to the harm of our security and the harm of the international order. Well, we see that in Syria with Russia. We've seen that often with some of the investments in the way that China handles Africa and what they're doing there. And so these two very important national security issues are intertwined. They impact our security. And this idea of making sure that we prevent things from happening before we have to deal with them, that's what Dan Coates wakes up every day to do. But anything that we can do to help and advance his work before he gets that intelligence is certainly resources well spent, and that's really the purpose of this commission.
Let's talk a little about fragile states. President Lindborg, the task force is charged not with preventing terrorism, but also very particularly addressing the underlying causes of extremism in fragile states. Why is it so important to focus on fragile states? And when we talk about them, what are the conditions in fragile states that drive extremism?
Thank you. Every fragile state is fragile in its own way, but what we're seeing is some shared characteristics. They are usually states where the social contract between the government and its people have broken down. And you usually have highly fragmented populations, pervasive sense of injustice, lack of opportunities, both economic as well as social and political. So you have a large disenfranchised and aggrieved population who feel they have few choices in a state that is not responsive to their needs. And this is fertile ground for extremist groups to recruit, to provide an alternative. And what we've seen is over the last decade and a half, the rise of extremism, particularly in fragile states, and increasingly with the goal to hold territory, whether it's Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Boko Haram in Nigeria, and of course ISIS in Syria and Iraq. And so in addition to the military capabilities to degrade their ability to hold territory, for us to really get ahead of this, we need to work in partnership with fragile states, with international partners, to really understand and address those underlying causes.
Let me ask a follow-up question if I can. The situation in these states is very complex. We've been working for now 17 years in Afghanistan, some 15 years in Iraq. And I think a lot of Americans wonder, can we really make a difference? Do we know what we're doing here? And are there examples where we have been able to help fragile states from falling into conflict and extremism, or help fragile states to become more resistant to conflict and extremism?
Well, one of the things that we're doing on the task force is to bring forward the many lessons from both the world of counterterrorism and violent extremism, as well as a lot of learnings about what goes on in fragile states. And we are seeing that sometimes at subnational levels, there is success in helping communities or regions become more resilient to the recruitment efforts of extremists. One example, and it's a mixed example, and as you said, it's highly complicated, would be Tunisia, where even though they've had a great outflow of fighters to Syria and Iraq, there are also lots of examples of communities within Tunisia that have resisted the extremist recruitment efforts. And it is one of the most important countries to have navigated the turmoil over the last decade.
Senator Ayotte, a lot of Americans, I think, would say, why is it that we have to do everything? And particularly, why is it that we have to pay for carrying these burdens? What is the potential for other countries, either in the region or internationally, or international institutions, to contribute to this, solving this problem?
Well, I think that this is obviously a threat to us, but it's a threat to our allies, it's a threat to the world, and in terms of the ability to live in peace, in international order, with rule of law. And so I think one of the things we are going to focus on in this task force and are focusing on is also coalitions that can be built, not only with our NATO partners, but the Arab nations and others, because this is something that, I have a firm belief that the United States is the indispensable nation when it comes to leading in this regard, but we do need partners, and we should seek out partners. We should not have to do this alone, and that is one of the goals that we have in this commission. And frankly, we're not going to be effective if we try to go alone on issues that we're dealing with the fragility, with fragile states, with extremism, because this is something that we need the partners. We need the local partners on the ground. And that's one of the emphasis you've seen in our initial report, and that we're also focusing on, because we need that commitment from the local partners when we are working with a country to be effective, rather than just thinking that as the United States we can solve it all ourselves.
Governor Kaine, last question for you. You and Congressman Hamilton were very effective in getting the 9/11 Commission recommendations implemented. What are the obstacles you see in your way of getting the recommendations that are going to come out of this task force dealing and preventing extremism, getting them to be implemented? And is it possible in the current environment to do, as you two co-chairs have told the rest members of the task force, that you want to develop a bipartisan consensus in support of a strategy that could involve and be supported by both the Congress and the President? Is that really possible in the current environment we're in?
Yes, I think it's possible. In fact, I was very encouraged today. We were meeting with security people at the White House, and the administration is getting ready their national security plan. And the first thing they said to me when I got there was, we thought as we started to move through this process and talk to so many people that we would find the partisanship that's everywhere. I said, we didn't find any. When you're dealing with national security issues, the partisanship seems to disappear. Now that was very encouraging. And I think that's true. I mean, we're going to be partisan about keeping America safe. And that's something we should all be working together on. And we had it easier, frankly, in 9/11 because everybody was focused on 9/11. Everybody was so shocked by what happened. With the families at our backs, everybody wanted recommendations put through and changes put through, which would make sure it never happened again. So we had a tremendous wind at our back in trying to get those recommendations through Congress. There was opposition, but we sort of overcame the opposition sooner or later because we had such a force on our side, and it was bipartisan. Now, the problem we're going to have is that people are very distracted. There are so many things hitting everybody every day. I can't imagine serving in the Congress today and being hit by the issues that you get hit with day after day after day after day, and you just want to address one and you get hit by 6 others. So somehow we're going to have to convince a bipartisan majority in Congress that this is important to get their attention, and this is important enough to keep their attention for long enough to get some bipartisan action going. And that's not going to be easy. We'll need, frankly, the help of all of you in this room and a lot of others. But I think if we can really get their attention, and I think if the administration and the Congress understands that this is very much in the public interest, first of all. Secondly, that it's much less expensive than any strategy you've been following so far. And thirdly, that is deeply, deeply in the interest of the future of this country to start dealing with these states and dealing with these terrorists before they get organized enough to come and attack us. If we can convince people of that and keep the attention of the Congress and the President, then I think we can get it done, but it's not going to be easy. We need everybody's help.
Terrific. Thank you very much, panel. This concludes the formal portion of our program. You should have all had on your seats a copy of the Bipartisan Task Force report. I hope you will read it. It is worth reading. It's also available on the USIP website. The task force will now turn towards developing specific recommendations, building on this initial task force report. Those should be available in January or shortly thereafter, and you should look for our final report at that time frame. I want to congratulate Governor Kane and Congressman Hamilton for the receipt of the Patriot Award. I want to thank them for their wise and effective leadership of this task force. They are the reason a lot of us signed up for this duty, and we're delighted to have you. I want to thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for co-hosting this wonderful evening. And I think we should all join that on this 17th anniversary of 9/11, let's let the memory of those who lost their lives that day recommit us tonight to work together to ensure that this country never suffers such a loss in the future. Thank you all for coming tonight.